It had been a quiet weekend at my girlfriend's family cabin, the kind of quiet I was looking forward to. Just a chance to unwind, surrounded by nature with none of the stress from work. Emma, my girlfriend, was off on a quick grocery run, and her aunt, Rachel, had stayed back at the cabin to finish up some reading. I had offered to help, but Emma insisted I relax, saying she wouldn't be long. It was the first time I'd been around Rachel in a more relaxed setting. Away from the usual family gatherings, there was something about her presence that I hadn't really thought about until now. She was always so put together, effortlessly charming with a kind smile and a sense of poise that drew people in. But this weekend, as we sat together in the cozy living room, sharing the same space, I began to notice something different. Rachel wasn't much older than Emma, maybe in her early 40s. And though I had never thought of her in any way other than as Emma's aunt, I had begun to pick up on the small moments we shared throughout the weekend. The lingering glances, the slight hesitation in her smile when our eyes met. Nothing overt, nothing inappropriate, but enough to stir something in me that I couldn't quite place. That afternoon, after Emma had left, I decided to take a shower, hoping the warm water would clear my head of the tension I'd been feeling. The shower in the cabin was tucked away in the back corner of the house, surrounded by rustic wooden walls that made the place feel like a secluded retreat. As I stepped under the water, I closed my eyes, letting the steam and warmth relax my tense muscles. But as I stood there, lost in my thoughts, I heard the faint creak of the bathroom door opening. I froze, my heart racing, wondering if Emma had come back early. But when I turned to look, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't Emma. Rachel stood in the doorway, her gaze fixed on me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. She didn't say anything at first, didn't move. She just stood there, her eyes tracing the droplets of water sliding down my body, the tension between us thickening with every passing second. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. The air between us felt charged, electric, as if we both knew something unspoken had been building for far longer than we had allowed ourselves to acknowledge. I didn't mean to. I thought the bathroom was empty, Rachel finally said, her voice soft, almost breathless. But she didn't leave. She didn't turn away. Instead, she stepped further into the room, closing the door behind her with a quiet click. I stood frozen under the spray of the water, my pulse racing. The sound of the door closing behind Rachel felt deafening in the small space. The steam curled between us, making the atmosphere even more intense. Her eyes met mine for a brief moment, wide, conflicted, and yet there was something in her gaze that I couldn't quite ignore. It was curiosity, but also something deeper. Something that had been bubbling beneath the surface for a while. I didn't realize you were in here, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper now. She took a tentative step closer, but her feet didn't move toward the door. Every instinct in me told me to step back, to say something to break the thick silence that had settled between us. But I didn't. I just stood there, the water pouring over my skin, my eyes locked on hers. There was a tension that was impossible to ignore. Something between us that was heavy, charged. It had been there all weekend, in the way she lingered in conversations with me, in the way our hands had accidentally brushed against each other when she handed me a glass of wine the night before. I hadn't wanted to acknowledge it then, but now there was no denying it. Rachel swallowed hard, and I watched as her gaze flickered away for a moment, as if she was trying to gather her thoughts, to make sense of what she was feeling. Her hand lifted to her hair, tucking a loose strand behind her ear, and I could see the slight tremble in her fingers. "I should go," she whispered, but even as she said it, she didn't move. Instead, she took another small step forward, her eyes meeting mine once again, and the distance between us felt impossibly close. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, every part of me hyper-aware of her presence in the room. My mind raced with 1,000 reasons why this was wrong, why I should tell her to leave, but none of those thoughts made it past my lips. "Rachel," I began, my voice low-strained. I wasn't even sure what I was going to say, but it didn't matter. She took another step toward me, her bare feet making no sound on the tiled floor, and I could see the indecision written all over her face, the same conflict that was raging inside me. But there was something else there too, something unmistakable. Desire. "Is this wrong?" she asked softly, her voice trembling as she stood just inches away from me now. The question lingered in the air between us, heavy, full of all the things we weren't saying. Yes, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of the water. But, but I couldn't bring myself to finish the sentence, because the truth was, I didn't want her to leave. I didn't want to stop whatever this was, no matter how wrong it felt. The tension between us had been building for too long, and now, standing here with her so close, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Her hand reached out, trembling slightly as it brushed against my arm, and the touch sent a shockwave through me that I couldn't suppress. My skin tingled where her fingers had made contact, and I could feel the heat of her body, even though she hadn't yet moved any closer. I don't know what I'm doing, she admitted, her voice shaky, her gaze dropping to the floor for a brief moment. But then her eyes lifted again, locking onto mine, and I could see the truth behind her words. She knew exactly what she was doing, and so did I. Neither of us moved for a long moment, the air between us thick with anticipation, with the weight of everything that had led up to this point. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, the steam from the shower curling around us, making the space feel smaller, more intimate. And then, slowly, I reached out. My hand found hers, our fingers brushing lightly before I curled mine around hers, pulling her gently closer. Her breath hitched, and I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the conflict that mirrored my own. But she didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped forward until there was no space left between us, her body pressed against mine, the warmth of her skin searing into me. Rachel. I whispered again, but this time there was no protest in my voice. No attempt to stop what was happening. She looked up at me, her eyes searching mine for something, for reassurance, for understanding, for permission maybe. And then, without another word, she leaned in, her lips brushing softly against mine in a kiss that was hesitant, trembling, but full of the building between us for days. The kiss was soft at first, a tentative exploration, as if we were both testing the waters, unsure of what this meant. But then, as if something inside us both snapped, the kiss deepened, growing more urgent, more desperate. Her hand slid up to my chest, her fingers tangling in the wet strands of my hair as she pressed herself closer to me, her body melting into mine. I kissed her back, my hands finding her waist, pulling her against me as the water cascaded over us, the heat between us growing more intense with every passing second. The guilt, the wrongness of it all, lingered in the back of my mind, but it was drowned out by the overwhelming need I felt. The need to touch her, to hold her, to finally give in to the tension that had been simmering between us for so long. For a long time we stayed like that, lost in the kiss, in the heat of the moment, the rest of the world fading away. It was as if nothing else mattered. Emma, the consequences, the weight of what we were doing, all of it disappeared in the intensity of our connection. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless, our foreheads resting together as we struggled to catch our breath. Rachel's chest rose and fell rapidly, her hands still tangled in my hair, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of desire and guilt. We can't, she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. She didn't pull away. Neither did I. I know, I said softly, my hands still resting on her waist, but I don't want to stop. Rachel's breath was shaky, her lips still hovering close to mine as the weight of our actions settled around us. The steam from the shower thickened, and the soft patter of water was the only sound in the room. For a moment, everything felt suspended, as if time itself had slowed. Her eyes were locked on mine, and I could see the conflict there, the push and pull of desire and guilt, the same turmoil that was coursing through me. I don't either, she admitted, her voice barely audible, but the words hung heavy in the air between us. Her fingers tightened their grip on my shoulders, and for a split second, I thought she might pull me closer again, that we might give in to the tension fully. But instead, she stayed still, her breath coming in shallow gasps as we stood there, inches apart, the water cascading down our bodies. I felt a surge of something primal and raw, and before I could stop myself, I leaned in again, capturing her lips in another kiss. This one was deeper, more desperate, and the moment our mouths met, it was like the floodgates opened. Her hand slid down my chest, trembling slightly as she explored the contours of my skin, and I felt my pulse quicken in response. We were crossing a line that couldn't be undone, and we both knew it, but neither of us seemed willing to stop.
The connection between us had grown too strong, too undeniable. And now, standing in the steam-filled shower, the pull was impossible to resist. Rachel's fingers slipped up into my hair, tugging lightly as she kissed me harder, her body pressing closer to mine, the warmth of her skin against mine sending shockwaves through me. Every touch, every brush of her lips against mine, only deepened the intensity of what we were feeling, and I could feel the world around us falling away. For what felt like an eternity, we stayed like that, entangled in each other, the steam swirling around us, lost in the heat of the moment. But as the kiss grew more urgent, more fervent, the reality of what we were doing began to creep in. With a sharp inhale, Rachel pulled back, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she struggled to catch her breath. Her eyes were wide, her lips swollen from our kiss, and I could see the conflict etched into every line of her face. "We have to stop," she said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of the words. But even as she spoke, she didn't move away. She stayed close, her body still pressed against mine, her fingers resting lightly on my chest. "I know," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. The silence between us was thick, charged with everything we weren't saying, with the undeniable attraction that had been building between us for weeks. But now, standing here together, the guilt was starting to sink in, the reality of the situation pressing down on us. This isn't fair to her," Rachel murmured, her voice shaky. "To Emma." The mention of Emma's name hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt the weight of our actions crash over me all at once. Emma, the woman I was supposed to be in love with, the woman who trusted me. And here I was, standing in the shower with her aunt, tangled in something forbidden and impossible to justify. "I don't want to hurt her," I said quietly, the guilt settling deep in my chest. But even as I said the words, I knew the damage was already done. There was no going back from this, no way to undo the betrayal we had committed. Rachel nodded, tears welling in her eyes as she looked down at the floor. "Neither do I." For a long moment we just stood there, the water running down our bodies, the tension between us thick and suffocating. I could feel the pull of her, the desire that hadn't faded, but now it was tainted with the overwhelming guilt that had taken its place in the back of my mind. I should go," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, but neither of us moved. The weight of everything we had just done, everything we hadn't said, was too much, and yet I couldn't bring myself to let her go. The connection between us was still there, simmering beneath the surface, and I knew that no matter what we said, it wasn't going to disappear. But slowly, after what felt like an eternity, Rachel stepped back, her hands slipping from my chest as she took a shaky breath. Her eyes were filled with unshed tears, her lips trembling as she looked up at me one last time. "This can't happen again," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I swallowed hard, the words catching in my throat as I nodded. "I know." She turned away, her movements hesitant, as if she wasn't sure she could bring herself to leave. And for a brief moment, I wanted to reach out, to pull her back into my arms, to tell her that we didn't have to stop, that we could figure it out. But I knew better. We had already crossed the line, and any further would only make things worse. Rachel opened the bathroom door, the cool air from the hallway rushing in as she slipped out without another word. The door clicked shut behind her, and the sound echoed in the small space, leaving me alone in the now too silent bathroom, the water still running over me. I stood there for a long time after she left, the guilt and desire warring inside me, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me like a heavy stone. I had no idea how I was going to face Emma, how I was going to pretend like nothing had happened when everything between us had just changed. The rest of the weekend passed in a blur. Rachel and I barely looked at each other, our conversations brief, strained, as if we were both trying to pretend that the tension wasn't still simmering beneath the surface. But every time our eyes met, I could feel it, the pull that hadn't gone away, the connection that we couldn't ignore. Emma never noticed, of course. She was her usual bright, cheerful self, completely unaware of the storm that was raging between Rachel and me. But the guilt gnawed at me with every passing moment, with every smile Emma gave me, every innocent touch of her hand on mine. I didn't know how long we could keep up the charade, how long we could pretend like nothing had changed. The guilt, the desire, the confusion, it was all too much, too overwhelming. And yet, even as the weight of it pressed down on me, I couldn't shake the memory of Rachel's touch, the way her lips had felt against mine, the way we had both given in to something we couldn't control. The weekend ended, and we all went back to our normal lives, but nothing felt normal anymore. Rachel and I didn't speak about what had happened, didn't acknowledge the tension that still lingered between us. But I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over, that the connection between us, the pull that had brought us together in the shower, hadn't gone away, and I wasn't sure if it ever would.